There are cases that start as a simple disappearance and end up becoming a story that divides an entire country. And this is one of them because what happened on a Thai island in the summer of 2023 ended with a Spaniard detained, a Colombian surgeon dead, and an investigation that completely changed the lives of everyone involved. Daniel Sancho was not a stranger in Spain before all of this, as he was primarily known for being the son of the actor Rodolfo Sancho and for his occasional exposure on social media and personal projects related to cooking. A life that mixed the visibility of his last name with a career still in progress. Without a consolidated professional path, but with enough media presence that his name was not foreign to the public. In the summer of 2023, Daniel was in Thailand on a period of personal travel, moving through Southeast Asia without a fixed residence and with prolonged stays in tourist areas in the south of the country where the pace of life is different. Freer, more dispersed, and with less control than in traditional urban environments. This context would become important later because everything that happens in the story takes place in an environment where privacy is easy to obtain but also difficult to reconstruct afterward. Parallel to his stay, Edwin Arrieta appears in the story, a Colombian surgeon with a stable professional life in his country and active medical work who had maintained prior contact with Daniel before physically meeting in Asia. This is a key detail because this case does not begin with two strangers crossing paths by chance, but with a prior relationship that already existed on a digital level and which, over time, led to a real encounter in Thailand. The nature of that relationship is one of the great points of debate in the case, because while the judicial investigation focuses on the events that occurred on the island, subsequent versions have tried to explain the prior bond in very different ways. However, the only thing that can be affirmed with certainty is that they both knew each other before seeing each other in person, and that prior contact was enough for Edwin to travel to Thailand with the intention of meeting Daniel. And this is where the case changes tone radically because, after that encounter, Edwin disappears without a trace. He stops responding to those around him, his family begins to worry immediately, and what initially seemed like a temporary disconnection quickly becomes a real alert when there are no signs of his whereabouts nor any activity that allows him to be located. The Thai police then enter the scene and begin an investigation focused on reconstructing his last movements and identifying the last person who was with him, who turns out to be precisely Daniel Sancho. From that moment on, the case ceases to be a simple disappearance and begins to become a full-fledged criminal investigation where every hour begins to matter. As the investigation progresses, the twist that changes everything occurs. Human remains appear in different areas of the island, including landfill areas and other dispersed locations, which immediately transforms the case into a homicide investigation and leads to the forensic identification of the remains, confirming they belong to Edwin Arrieta, which leaves no room for doubt about his passing. From there, Daniel Sancho is detained and interrogated by Thai authorities while his movements are reconstructed. The purchases made in the previous days, the movements within the island, and the complete chronology of the hours following the last known contact with Edwin, thus entering a phase of investigation in which every detail begins to have a determining weight. And at this point, the story splits into two completely opposite versions because the prosecution maintains that everything corresponds to a homicide followed by a series of acts intended to hide what happened, while the defense posits that the death was not planned and that everything was triggered by an unforeseen situation that ended violently within a context of conflict between the two. From here begins the most media-intensive judicial process of the case, with forensic evidence, testimonies, reconstructions, and a trial in Thailand that will not only attempt to determine what happened, but also why it happened and under what exact circumstances the outcome of a story that began as a trip and ended in one of the most commented-on international cases of recent years occurred. The hours prior to August 2, 2023, are the real core of the case because that is where everything that the police investigation in Thailand will later attempt to reconstruct is concentrated, and it is also the point where a relatively clear sequence of what happens before Edwin Arrieta's disappearance is held for the last time. At that moment, both are already in the Koh Phangan area and have confirmed the physical encounter after a prior relationship that had been maintained at a distance. What is relevant here is that it is not an improvised encounter in the middle of a casual situation, but a date previously agreed upon between two people who had already been in contact before the trip. During that day, the joint displacement between both within the island occurs, a movement that will subsequently be key because it places Edwin with Daniel in different points of Koh Phangan before reaching the place where his trail is lost definitively. The subsequent police reconstruction places these movements as part of the critical chronology of the case because they help to establish the last leg of his life with precision. At some point in that sequence, both access private accommodation of the bungalow type where the last confirmed contacts between them take place. These types of spaces on the island are relevant because they allow for total privacy and do not have constant surveillance, which makes what happened inside depend exclusively on subsequent reconstruction based on forensic evidence, testimonies, and movement analysis. From that point on, Edwin stops having public activity or communication with his environment and disappears from his family's radar, which in the beginning does not generate an absolute immediate alarm but quickly becomes a concern when the silence is prolonged and there is no sign of his whereabouts or response to contact attempts. Edwin's family then begins to try to locate him directly while the lack of response becomes increasingly anomalous, and it is in this context that the formal alert is activated, which will eventually reach the Thai authorities, thus beginning the investigation phase for a missing person. The police begin to systematically reconstruct Edwin's last known hours, and in that process, a central element appears that will completely change the direction of the case because the last person identified with him in the temporal sequence is precisely Daniel Sancho, which automatically makes him a key piece of the initial investigation. In parallel to this, reviews of movements, displacements, and possible points of contact within the island begin, a reconstruction that is not simple due to the characteristics of the environment but which little by little narrows the circle on what happened in those critical hours. And it is right at this point that the investigation ceases to be a simple search for a missing person because indications begin to appear that do not fit with a voluntary or accidental disappearance. And the case enters a completely different phase where the possibility of a violent act is already being contemplated. Shortly after, the discovery that changes everything occurs. Human remains appear in different locations on the island, some in landfill areas and others in dispersed environments, which forces the authorities to activate full forensic analyses to determine their origin and identity. The result of those analyses confirms that the remains belong to Edwin Arrieta, which definitively transforms the investigation into a homicide case and not a disappearance. From that moment, the priority ceases to be finding a living person and becomes reconstructing how and under what circumstances his death occurred. It is then that Daniel Sancho is detained by Thai authorities and interrogated as the main suspect in the case's chronology, while investigators begin to connect pieces between testimonies, registered movements, previous purchases, and reconstructions of the day of the encounter. And this is where the case enters its most intense phase because it is no longer just about knowing what happened but about proving it, with two completely different versions that begin to face each other directly on the judicial level. One version that maintains the existence of a homicide with subsequent actions to hide it, and another that defends that everything was triggered in an unplanned context that ended violently and unexpectedly. What happens next is precisely what turns this case into an investigation of enormous media repercussion, because once Edwin Arrieta's death is confirmed, the Thai authorities are no longer trying to figure out if a crime occurred, but who is responsible and how they can prove it before a tribunal. As investigators reconstruct the hours before and after the disappearance, they begin to review every movement made by Daniel Sancho during his stay on the island, something that may seem simple from the outside but which in reality implies analyzing displacements, employee testimonies, accommodation records, purchases made, and any element that allows for the reconstruction of a coherent timeline of the events. It is then that a series of data begin to appear that for the investigation acquire enormous importance because they are not limited solely to the moment of death but also to everything that occurred before and after it. And it is precisely that complete sequence that the prosecution will later use to defend that it was not a simple accident. One of the aspects that receives the most attention during the investigation is certain purchases made before Edwin's disappearance. Purchases that will eventually be analyzed during the trial because the investigators consider they may be related to what happened subsequently. The police compile information on objects acquired in establishments on the island and try to determine when they were bought, who bought them, and what their real purpose was, a question that may seem secondary but will end up becoming one of the great points of discussion of the judicial procedure. Meanwhile, the search for remains and evidence continues in different points of Koh Phangan, and each new finding allows investigators to better reconstruct the sequence following Edwin's death, a sequence that for the prosecution is especially relevant because it understands that certain subsequent actions are incompatible with the idea of a simple accident followed by an impulsive reaction. As the investigation progresses, public attention begins to grow exponentially and the case ceases to be a local affair in Thailand to become international news, especially in Spain and Colombia, where the protagonist's identity provokes enormous media interest. On one side is Daniel Sancho, son of a well-known actor in Spain. On the other is Edwin Arrieta, a Colombian professional whose disappearance and subsequent death generate enormous shock among family, friends, and professional colleagues. And in the middle of both appears an investigation that every week incorporates new elements that fuel public debate. Meanwhile, Daniel remains in the custody of Thai authorities, and details begin to emerge about his initial statements. Statements that will subsequently acquire enormous relevance because the prosecution and the defense will interpret the meaning of those manifestations made during the first moments of the investigation very differently. From the beginning, a public battle over the account of the facts arises because while Thai authorities continue working on material evidence and chronological reconstructions, alternative explanations regarding the relationship between both, the circumstances of the death, and the possible motive for what occurred begin to circulate in the media. The defense tries to present a specific interpretation of the prior relationship between Daniel and Edwin while the prosecution focuses on objective elements of the investigation, thus generating two narratives that for months will coexist in parallel both inside and outside the tribunals. And the more the case advances, the more evident it becomes that the true battlefield will not be only determining who caused Edwin's death, something the investigation already considers clarified in its main lines, but establishing whether that happened improvisationally or if there existed some type of prior planning. Because in legal terms that difference is gigantic and can mean the distance between a much more limited sentence or one of the most severe penalties provided for by Thai legislation. While public debate grows and the media fill hours of programming with analysis, hypotheses, and declarations, the police continue accumulating evidence with a very concrete objective: to present before the tribunals a complete reconstruction of what happened from the moment Edwin arrives on the island to the instant his remains begin to be found in different points of Koh Phangan. And little by little, the case begins to head toward the moment everyone is waiting for: the trial, a process that will not only determine Daniel Sancho's future but will also put to the test all the versions that for months have been told about what occurred on that Thai island. Because when finally the moment to sit before the judges arrives, neither speculations, nor headlines, nor television interviews will suffice. There, only the evidence, the testimonies, and each party's capacity to convince the tribunal that their version of the facts is the one that most closely approximates the truth will matter. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, Edwin Arrieta's family began living hours of authentic desperation. What for Daniel Sancho were already moments of maximum tension, for the Colombian surgeon's family and friends was a completely different anguish. Edwin did not appear. He did not answer messages. He did not answer calls. And something did not add up. Because those who knew Edwin described him as an extremely communicative person. He could take a few hours to respond, he could be busy working, he could be traveling, but disappearing completely was not habitual for him. As the day of August 3rd and subsequently August 4th advanced, the concern began to grow. Family, friends, and close people began trying to reconstruct what had been his last movements. And in that reconstruction, one name appeared inevitably: Daniel Sancho. Because he was the last known person who had been with him. In fact, some people close to Edwin reached out to Daniel to ask him if he knew anything about his whereabouts. And here there is a detail that over time would be analyzed to satiety. Daniel responded with apparent normality. He said they had been together, that they had shared time, but that afterward each one had gone their own way. At that moment, nobody could imagine what was really occurring. The son of a famous actor, a missing Colombian surgeon, a paradisiacal Thai island, a dismembered corpse, and an investigation that every day revealed more disturbing details. The news exploded media-wise in a way rarely seen. Television programs, digital front pages, endless debates, informative specials. Everyone was talking about the case. But while televisions filled hours and hours of programming, in Thailand the investigators continued working. Because for them, what was important was not the media spectacle. It was gathering evidence. And the further they advanced, the more complex the scenario they were reconstructing seemed. There were remains found in different points. There were movement records. There were forensic analyses. There were cameras. There were testimonies. And there were questions that still had no answer. Because it was one thing to determine who had been with Edwin in his last hours, and another very different thing to reconstruct exactly what had occurred inside that bungalow. What they said to each other. How the confrontation began. What happened in the decisive minutes. And above all, if that had been an accident, an impulsive act, or something prepared beforehand. That would be precisely the great battle that would mark the entire subsequent judicial process. And it would be a battle that would divide opinions for months. Because from here on, the story was no longer going to be about a crime. It was going to become a war of versions. A media war. And a judicial war that would end up reaching Thai tribunals with enormous international attention on it. And the most surprising thing is that the truly intense part was still to come. Because once Daniel Sancho is detained, the case ceases to be solely a police investigation to become one of the biggest media phenomena of the last few years in Spain. What at first seemed like just another international piece of news begins to transform into a story followed practically minute by millions of people. Each declaration is analyzed. Each photograph is studied. Each video becomes news. And each new piece of information generates hours of debate on television. Meanwhile, Daniel remains in the custody of Thai authorities. And it is precisely during those first days that some of the most important events of the whole case occur. Because according to information incorporated subsequently into the procedure, Daniel participates in the location of different remains of Edwin Arrieta and in the reconstruction of certain movements related to the events. This point would subsequently have enormous judicial importance. Why? Because the sentence itself would end up considering that collaboration as one of the elements that justified the commutation of the death penalty to life imprisonment. And this is important to understand from the beginning. Because many times it has been told as if the death penalty had disappeared from the case for other reasons. But the judicial resolution itself expressly points to Daniel's initial collaboration as one of the relevant factors for that decision. Meanwhile, in Spain, family, lawyers, and advisors began to mobilize. And here a key figure in this whole story appears. Rodolfo Sancho. Because if until that moment he was known primarily for being Daniel's father and for his acting career, starting in August 2023, he occupies a central position within the case. Rodolfo travels to Thailand. He maintains contacts with lawyers. He takes an interest in his son's situation. And little by little, a defense strategy begins to be organized that would end up generating an enormous amount of headlines. A strategy that, as the months passed, would evolve in a very striking way. Because the first information that transpires during those days seems to point in a relatively clear direction. However, as the weeks pass, new accounts begin to emerge. New explanations, new hypotheses, and new versions of what occurred. It is at that moment that an idea begins to be popularized that would end up occupying thousands of hours of television. The theory of the supposed toxic relationship between Daniel Sancho and Edwin Arrieta. According to this defense line, Edwin would have exercised strong pressure on Daniel for a long time. There was talk of economic dependency. There was talk of emotional control. There was talk of threats. There was even talk of a supposed situation of harassment and blackmail. And for months, a large part of media coverage revolved around that narrative. However, here it is advisable to clearly separate accredited facts from the parties' theories. Because what was stated publicly is one thing. And what finally managed to be accredited before the tribunal is something very different. And precisely there is where some of the biggest controversies of the whole procedure would appear. While the media debated about personal relationships, blackmail, and psychological pressures, the investigators continued building an extremely detailed chronology of the days prior to Edwin's death. They analyzed displacements, reservations, purchases, messages, camera records, and any element that could help determine what had really occurred. And the more the investigation advanced, the more importance those purchases made by Daniel before Edwin's arrival on the island acquired. Because it was not solely about a knife. According to the case documentation, there also existed purchases of trash bags, gloves, and diverse utensils that ended up being the object of discussion during the whole process. The prosecution interpreted those elements as indications of preparation. The defense offered alternative explanations. And for months an intense confrontation would occur regarding the real meaning of each of those acquisitions. But the problem for the defense was that not only an isolated purchase was discussed. The complete set of circumstances was discussed. And when investigators placed all the pieces on the table, they maintained that the resulting scenario pointed in a very concrete direction. While all this was occurring, Edwin Arrieta's figure began to be often eclipsed by the enormous media noise surrounding Daniel Sancho. And yet Edwin was the victim of this whole story. A Colombian surgeon who had built a recognized professional career in his country, who maintained close relationships with his family, and whose death had generated enormous shock both in Colombia and in numerous places in Latin America. His family began from the very first moment a battle to claim justice. And that battle they would maintain during the whole judicial process. Without rest. Without ever abandoning the case. And facing additionally an enormous public exposure. Because each new theory that appeared in the media ended up repercussing directly on Edwin's image. And that provoked enormous tension during the whole procedure. As months passed, the police investigation began to give way to the next great scenario of this story. The trial. A trial held in Thailand under procedural rules very different from Spanish ones. A trial that many media outlets presented almost as a mystery. And a trial about which all sorts of rumors began to circulate. Some assured that the prosecution had the case completely won. Others defended that the defense strategy was going to dismantle the whole investigation. There were those who spoke of reckless homicide. There were those who spoke of premeditated murder. There were those who assured that Daniel would end up returning soon to Spain. And there were those who warned that he could face one of the toughest sentences provided for by Thai legislation. For months practically everything was said. But the reality would end up being much more forceful than many imagined. Because when finally the moment to sit before the Thai judges arrived, some of the versions that had dominated television programs for almost a year began to encounter a huge problem. They had to be defended before a tribunal. And that was something very different from defending them on a television set. And precisely there, one of the most surprising phases of the whole case would begin. Because when the trial arrives, something happens that leaves many of the people who had followed the case for months disconcerted. For almost a year, public debate had been dominated by a series of ideas that seemed to repeat themselves constantly. That Daniel lived subjected to enormous pressure. That Edwin blackmailed him. That threats existed. That there was some kind of limit situation that had led the young Spaniard to act desperately. However, when the moment to declare before the judges arrives, some of those affirmations begin to dilute surprisingly. And here is where one of the most controversial parts of the whole procedure begins. Because Daniel Sancho's declaration automatically becomes the center of attention. It was the moment everyone was waiting for. The instant in which at last he was going to explain directly what had occurred inside that bungalow. What happened during the last hours of Edwin Arrieta's life. And what was exactly his version of the facts. According to the version exposed by Daniel during the trial, he and Edwin were together in the bungalow when an unexpected situation occurred. Daniel maintained that he did not know that Edwin felt sexual attraction toward him. Something that drew special attention because for months a large part of the media discourse had revolved precisely around that supposed problematic relationship between both. According to his account, Edwin had come to the bungalow because he was supposedly going to speak about a possible investment related to his projects. And it is then that, according to Daniel, a sexual proposal that triggers an argument occurs. From there, the version presented describes a physical confrontation that ends with several accidental falls. The defense maintained that Edwin suffered blows during that struggle and that the death occurred unintentionally. Subsequently, according to that same explanation, Daniel would have entered into a situation of panic that led him to make the subsequent decisions related to the body. This version generated enormous controversy. Because the prosecution maintained a completely different interpretation of the facts. And because also many of the material proofs presented during the procedure were valued by the tribunal differently than the defense intended. While Daniel offered his account, the judges also listened to numerous witnesses and specialists. Police, interpreters, personnel related to the investigation, those responsible for the places where the events developed, and distinct experts who participated in the process. Each declaration added a new piece to the puzzle, and little by little, the global image that the judges had to value took shape. One of the aspects that generated the most attention was the discussion about the supposed threats that for so long had appeared in public debate. Because one of the questions that constantly hovered over the case was very simple. If threats really existed continuously, where were the proofs of those threats? Messages, emails, conversations, audios, documents, any verifiable element. The defense insisted for a long time that there existed a situation of pressure on Daniel. However, the legal discussion focused precisely on what elements could be accredited objectively and which could not. And there was one of the main battlefields of the trial. Another especially important point was the analysis of everything that occurred before Edwin's death. Because the judges did not only value what happened inside the bungalow. They also analyzed everything that had occurred previously. The purchases made, the displacements, the planning of the trip, the reservations, the movements registered by cameras, and the complete sequence of events that led to that August afternoon. For the prosecution, the set of those elements allowed for speaking of premeditation. For the defense, no. And that difference was absolutely crucial, because on it depended in large measure the final legal qualification of the facts. Meanwhile, outside the tribunals, media expectation continued to be gigantic. Each day of the trial generated headlines. Each leak occupied front pages. Each detail was discussed for hours on television. Spain continued pending Thailand. And Thailand continued developing the process according to its own judicial rules. As the sessions advanced, some observers began to perceive that the situation did not seem as favorable for the defense as certain programs had predicted for months. The expectations that had been created were enormous. There were those who spoke of a much lighter sentence, even of relatively optimistic scenarios for Daniel. But the reality that was developing inside the tribunal seemed much more complicated. And finally, the decisive day arrived. August 29, 2024. The date that would mark forever the outcome of that first great judicial battle. The room was prepared. The families waited. The journalists remained pending any novelty. And millions of people followed the news from different countries. Then the judges made their decision public. Daniel Sancho was declared guilty. And the initial sentence imposed was the death penalty. Although immediately that penalty was commuted to life imprisonment due to the criteria applied by the tribunal, among them the initial collaboration recognized in the investigation. The news provoked an authentic media earthquake, because it supposed a huge blow for those who had defended for months that the result would be very different. And because it confirmed that the judge's interpretation was much closer to the prosecution's thesis than to the version maintained by the defense. But far from ending there, the case entered a new phase. Because after knowing the sentence, another war began. The one of the appeals. The one of the attempts to modify or revert the conviction. And while that occurred, Daniel would definitely leave the Koh Phangan prison to be transferred to a maximum security prison. A change that would mark the beginning of a new reality for him. A reality very different from the one he had lived during the first months of detention. And a reality that still today continues being the object of constant attention while the case continues writing new chapters. And if someone thought that the sentence was going to put an end to the case, the reality was exactly the opposite. Because after knowing the conviction, a new battle began that, although much less visible than the initial investigation or the trial, could result just as important for Daniel Sancho's future. The battle of the appeals. The legal battle that still keeps some questions of the procedure open. But before entering that phase, there is something that is worth pausing to analyze. Because during the whole case, there was a question that millions of people asked themselves again and again. What really happened inside that bungalow? And the reality is that probably only two people knew exactly what occurred in those minutes. One died that afternoon, and the other is Daniel Sancho. Everything else is reconstructions, evidence, indications, expert reports, declarations, conflicting versions, and judicial conclusions. But the exact sequence of each second will probably never come to be known 100%. That is something that occurs in many criminal processes. Judges do not need to know absolutely everything that occurred to dictate sentence. They need to determine which version results compatible with the evidence and which does not. And precisely that was what they did in this case. Even so, the enormous media repercussion provoked an infinity of theories to appear. Some reasonable, others completely ridiculous. There were those who spoke of conspiracies. There were those who assured that there existed third parties involved. There were those who affirmed that evidence was being hidden. There were those who even proposed scenarios worthy of a fictional movie. However, none of those theories came to have reflection in the judicial resolution. And here it is important to differentiate between speculation and accredited facts. Because one thing are the hypotheses that can be debated publicly. And another very different thing are the proofs that end up being accepted by a tribunal. For example, a theory that some observers have proposed for years is that Daniel could have led Edwin to the bungalow using some apparently innocent pretext. There does not exist public proof that allows knowing exactly what conversation they had before entering. Therefore, any concrete explanation would be speculative. But what does seem evident is that Edwin went voluntarily to that place and that there existed no indications that he expected what was going to occur afterward. That yes, it can be deduced from the set of known circumstances. And precisely for that reason, it continues to be one of the unknowns that generates most curiosity among those who have followed the case. How did Daniel convince Edwin to go there? What did they talk about during the previous hours? What did each one think was going to occur that day? They are questions for which we will probably never have complete answers. After the sentence, Daniel was transferred from the Koh Samui prison to the Surat Thani prison, considered a higher security jail within the Thai penitentiary system. And that transfer symbolized something much deeper than a simple change of penitentiary center. It represented the definitive end of the investigation and trial stage. From that moment, the stage of sentence fulfillment began. A completely different reality. Much harsher, much more prolonged, and much more difficult to face. Meanwhile, the two families continued living radically different situations. On one side, Daniel's family continued concentrating a good part of Spanish media attention. Each movement generated headlines. Each visit provoked news. Each declaration was analyzed by television programs. On the other side, Edwin's family tried to keep the victim's memory alive while claiming that the case not be forgotten. Because something that occurs frequently in very media-intensive events is that the accused ends up occupying all the focus of attention and the victim remains in the background. And many people close to Edwin denounced precisely that during the development of the case. That there was constant talk of Daniel, of his lawyers, of his situation, of his family, but much less of the person who had lost his life. With the passing of the months, media interest began to diminish regarding the absolutely enormous levels it had reached during 2023 and 2024. Something logical. All great cases end up losing presence when constant novelties disappear. But even so, Daniel Sancho's name continued appearing periodically in current events. Each appeal, each resolution, each judicial movement, each piece of news related to his penitentiary situation, placed the case back in the center of the conversation. And it is that there are stories that transcend the category of simple event. Cases that become social phenomena, that mix crime, fame, money, well-known families, international coverage, and an enormous emotional burden. And this was one of them. Because if we eliminate all the media attention, all the television debates, and all the controversies that surrounded the procedure, in the background remains an extremely simple and extremely tragic reality. A man traveled to Thailand. He never returned. His family lost a loved one forever. Another man was sentenced to spend a large part of his life in prison. And two families remained marked forever by facts that occurred during a few hours in August of 2023. A story that began on a paradisiacal island frequented by tourists from all over the world. And that ended up becoming one of the most media-intensive and commented-on criminal cases in recent history in the Spanish-speaking world. Until the next video.